Good morning. This is Paul Kempe, and I am a member of the Park Plaza Cornerstone class. And this is our presentation for Sunday, May 17th. This is an additional recording, and the live class was earlier today. And I hope that you get something from this. I am a cardiovascular surgeon, and I am speaking about blood today, both our blood and the blood of Christ. And this is based on a presentation earlier that we did one Sunday night. Partially, it is taken from a book by Philip Yancey and Paul Brand called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. And I'm going to share my screen now. I wanted to start by pointing out, as this book states, that our bodies are created by God and are created in His own image. We learned this from a couple of passages. One is Psalm 139, 13, and 14. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Another passage that is meaningful to me is Proverbs 8, 22 and 23. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts long ago. Ages ago, I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth. And I think this not only points out that God made us, but that also he made us early on. And the point of this presentation really doesn't have anything to do with evolution theory, but I think this verse makes me understand that my body and your body and all human bodies did not come as the result of some incremental stepwise development, starting with inanimate chemicals and eventually growing into single cells and then growing into humans, but in fact was directed by God and was set up before the beginning of the earth. I did want to give some credit to this book. It's a wonderful book if you get a chance to read any of it, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. It is by Philip Yancey together with an orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Paul Brand, who had a distinguished career largely as a medical missionary in India. So we're talking today about blood. I'm a cardiovascular surgeon, and I deal with blood pretty much on a daily basis. And have a pretty close relationship with it. That having been said, I did look up some things to present today so that I would try to have most of this be somewhat scientifically accurate. We're going to go over some science, and I made an attempt to make this a presentation that's not too nerdy, but at the same time, I wanted to get some introduction to blood and how blood works. It's a remarkable thing. Blood is made up of several components, the largest of which is water. And that's also true of our body in general. About 60% of our body weight is water. We know this, it varies a little bit based on how much fat and how much muscle and other tissue we have. But 60% is about an average. In blood, it's probably a little higher than that, although honestly, I was not able to find anyone who would make an estimate of that. But it's a large part of blood. Blood is a fluid. Within the blood, there are multiple components, some particulate components as well as fluid. Red blood cells are probably the largest by number, and there are about 5 million red blood cells on average in a milliliter of a human's blood when their counts are normal. Red blood cells have the function to carry oxygen, and they are interesting. Inside the red blood cell is a molecule called hemoglobin, which is a protein. Specifically, we call it a metalloprotein, and it has an iron molecule in it, an iron atom in it. And with that iron, it's able to bind and carry a tremendous amount of oxygen for the amount of volume that the red blood cell has. It carries it bound to this hemoglobin, and it is vastly more oxygen than could be carried just dissolved in the fluid of the blood. It carries this oxygen to all the tissues of the body so that they can use the oxygen, and oxygen is very important to all of our cells' function. Different cells can last different amounts of time without oxygen, but no cells can last independent of oxygen for long. The most sensitive is the brain, and if you cut off the supply of oxygen to the brain, then within 4 to 5 minutes, the neurons, the cells that make up the brain, will die and not be able to be revived. Next are the white blood cells, and we're going to talk some more about them today, but primarily white blood cells exist to function and fight infections. There are multiple types of white blood cells, but these are generally quite a lot larger than red cells physically. And some of them are somewhat indiscriminate in terms of attacking and defeating invading foreign material, including infections. Others are very specific. Lymphocytes tend to be very specific, and lymphocytes produce proteins called antibodies that bind to invaders and help the white cells to kill them. Another of what we call the formed elements of blood are platelets, which are small particles which have several functions, but a very important one is to initiate and aid in blood clotting. If you were to cut yourself, your bleeding will stop, and it largely stops because of a process called blood clotting that is initiated with platelets and strengthened by platelets. They also act as mediators of inflammatory response, which is also necessary to fight off infections. Lastly, there's plasma, which is just the remaining fluid that doesn't have any particles. Plasma contains proteins, including the clotting factors, the clotting factor are what help the blood also clot. The platelets initiate this, but clotting factors are proteins that are modified when it's needed and turn into a solid blood clot. But when they're not going through this modification, which we call the clotting cascade, they are just dissolved and they just float in the water that is the plasma. Nutrients are also carried in the plasma, including glucose, which our cells need to function. And all of these things are in perfect balance when things are normal, but can get out of balance and cause certain disease states, which we're not going to go into great detail about. The functions of blood, we talked a little bit about this, gas exchange. So there's oxygen, which cells need to carry out the functions of life. As oxygen is used, carbon dioxide is produced, and carbon dioxide then goes from the cell back into the blood to be carried to the lungs, where it's exchanged into the air for more oxygen. Carbon dioxide also is interesting in that it is an acidic molecule, and when it is in solution, it is slightly acidic. It is also the main buffer that keeps the pH of tissues and the blood within a very narrow range. It's really a neat design that the carbon dioxide, which is produced and going to be there anyway, also has a function that's very important to maintain proper function of all the chemical reactions that occur that put together make us alive. In addition to oxygen and buffering capability, blood also delivers glucose, amino acids, fats, and cholesterol, which are all used in carrying on the cell's normal and necessary functions. Blood removes toxins so that as carbon dioxide, but other toxins are produced, they are removed as the blood flows through. You might, if you have ever been working out hard, notice that you begin to get a burning sensation in your muscles that you're working. And this is due to some of these byproducts of your muscles working, one of which is lactic acid. And lactic acid hurts. So your muscles begin to cramp when you get really strenuous with exercise. So that's washed away, it's taken away, where it can be metabolized by other organs of the liver and such, and be returned to be used again. But because of all these things that blood does, life is simply not possible for larger advanced organisms without a blood system, blood supply going to the tissues. Single organisms like bacteria and protozoa, they live fine without any blood because the cells are just floating in the fluid where they directly exchange all these things. But as cells begin to be more specialized, they need this blood in order to continue to be alive. Blood is distributed through the body in a marvelous set of blood vessels, arteries, and veins, and in between those two are the capillary beds. Arteries carry the blood out of the left side of the heart and out to the body. The systemic arteries do. That's where all this nutrition and oxygen gets to the tissues, going through the capillaries. And this exchange largely occurs at the capillary level, which are very tiny microscopic blood vessels where a red blood cell can just barely fit through that. And every tissue of the body, there is no tissue that's not within the distance of a capillary that's about the length of the thickness of one of your hairs. So there's a capillary everywhere in your body's tissues so that this exchange can take place efficiently. Also, we have the heart, which is a efficient and complex organ and is a pump and is just a design that you can almost not imagine being able to be engineered by humans. And one of the things in this book was that Mr. Yancey asked that we imagine that the government was going to try and build a heart. So they were going to accept bids from engineers. Well, these are the specs that they'd want. It would need to have more than 75-year life expectancy without breaking down. It would not require any lubrication ever. It would not need any regular maintenance. Its weight could not exceed about 300 grams or 10.5 ounces. It has to pump 2,000 gallons a day. It has to have valves, again, which are very durable and which operate 4,000 to 5,000 cycles per hour, virtually without fail. And it has to have highly variable output from as little as 0.025 horsepower when at rest to bursts as high as 1 horsepower. Another thing that I want to point out is and this was pointed out in the book, so this isn't original to me, but if you think of the blood and the system of the blood almost like a river, if you were to take your cells and compare them to every human being on earth, it would be almost as though there's a river that comes somewhere out of the northern part of the world, let's say Canada, and it goes out and has multiple branches that branch, and then every single person on earth lives close enough to one of these branches that they can go there, and floating on this river are many, many millions of boats that contain everything you need: food, what you might need to build a house, if you're, say, a manufacturing worker, what you need to manufacture your product, anything you need. Teachers, it would have the things you need for a school and whatever. So then you take what you need and you load back on those boats everything that you no longer need, that you either have used up or have no further need for. So really, truly a remarkable way to think of that the blood that we have. So now I wanted to talk some about symbolism of blood, particularly in the Bible. Shed blood is a symbol of death. And in Genesis 4:10, the Lord said to Cain, after he killed Abel, and Cain tried to deny that he knew anything about it, the Lord said, "Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground," as though it had its own ability. Genesis 9:6, God tells Noah, "Whoever sheds the blood of a human by a human, shall that person's blood be shed, for in his own image God made humankind." So pointing out to us the importance that God places on blood. And blood is life. That's the other thing that we see. It is not to be taken lightly. It is considered literally be the life of the organism, the animal or human. In Genesis 9:4 and 5, God has just told Noah that they would be allowed to eat all the plants as before, and also now that the animals would be given them to be eaten. But God says, only you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning. And then again, when the law is being given to the Hebrews in Leviticus 7, 26 and 27, God says, you must not eat any blood whatever, either of a bird or of an animal, in any of your settlements. Any one of you who eats any blood shall be cut off from your kin. And from this law, a pretty intricate way of butchering animals and being sure that they're free of blood really grew up and is present today. In every kosher home, people are very careful not to have animals that weren't properly prepared to remove the blood, because it's a very serious offense. Another way that blood is life is when we are, when I am in surgery. I know that if someone hemorrhages extensively and I can't control that patient won't survive. I mean, the blood is necessary for life. Another way that blood is a symbol is it's an offering to God to remove sin and guilt. And this was a concept that was always a little bit difficult for me, but when you go back and understand how important blood was and was thought to be life, then it makes a little bit more sense. But God required the Israelites to bring an animal and to shed its blood in a ritualistic way to be able to be freed from their sins. And I'm not going to get into whether the sins were just rolled forward or were forgiven. But anyway, that's what they had to do. There were sin offerings and guilt offerings and multiple other offerings, and they're described in Leviticus chapters 4 through 7, if you want to take a look at that. In the New Testament, we find that blood cleanses, which is a function of blood in the body too. 1 John 1:7, but if we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin. Now I want to talk a bit about some spiritual applications and link them to things that happen with our earthly bodies as well. So we talked a little bit about hemorrhage and about how blood is life. And if someone has hemorrhage, they can actually lose their life. And it can end pretty abruptly. And I've seen this before. I had a patient several years ago who sustained a gunshot wound, and it severed several very large arteries in the chest. And try as we could, we could not stop the hemorrhage and give him blood back fast enough to save his life. In another, just a few weeks ago, I got a call. I was at home, but it was on call about a patient who had been stabbed and had a hole in his aorta, which is a big artery and can bleed pretty profoundly. And when he came into the ER, they were doing CPR. He was clinically not alive, but he was able to be transfused quickly. One of the first things that happens in the trauma rooms is that people obtain access to administer things by intravenous lines. And he was given a rather large and rather rapid blood transfusion, and he came back. The aorta was then fixed, and the patient went on to do pretty well. So, again, life is blood. Now, I think when we have sin in our life, it causes a spiritual hemorrhage, so to speak. And so we lose our spirituality and we lose our spiritual life. And the blood of Jesus was given to us to be an ongoing, repetitive spiritual transfusion. And it does reverse the effects of the sin that's in our lives. We did talk a good bit about infection, particularly at this time. We have this pandemic, which is a viral infection going through the world and causing all manner of havoc. Again, when an infection occurs, blood is really the first line of defense. It provides the white cells, which literally rush to the scene and pretty much carry out a war against the invaders. The less efficient way for the white cells to kill invaders is just to non-specifically take out the things that aren't normal tissue. Meanwhile, at the same time, the lymphocytes come to the scene, and some of those lymphocytes have the job to recognize the foreign material and to create antibodies, which are small proteins that are then put into the bloodstream, and those proteins bind to a portion of the invader and make it easier for other white cells to kill them. And it's really difficult, if not impossible, for us to be able to fight off an infection completely and recover from an infection if we don't develop antibodies. One of the things that happens too, though, is that once we have antibodies, then that's memory, and those lymphocytes create those antibodies from then on, anytime it's needed. And a little bit might be circulating of those antibodies in the blood all the time, so that if that same organism, that same coronavirus comes back, or whatever sort of infection comes back, then there's none of this period of time that's less efficient. Antibodies immediately bind, and those things can be killed before they cause a real disease. So it's important. You may also have heard about this convalescent serum, where people who have been exposed to the virus and have made antibodies, well, their plasma is given to someone who is very, very ill with coronavirus. Those antibodies then attach and allow their immune system to kill the coronavirus, and several patients have recovered fairly quickly with that. So it's important that we're going to talk about Jesus coming to earth, and the parallel here is that Jesus can be like our convalescent serum, but also like a vaccine. The convalescent serum uses someone else's antibodies. The vaccine is where we are able to give a modified version of a virus to people who then make antibodies which are effective against the virus. A couple of scriptures are important here to sort of make this parallel. Hebrews 2:10, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things that exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings, pointing out that Jesus came and he experienced these infections of sin, these temptations, these sufferings, so that he could then, so to speak, make those spiritual antibodies. In Revelation 12:11, there's a scene where Satan is conquered, and it states, but they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb. So again, here we see Jesus' blood is necessary to conquer sin. In Hebrews 4:11, the Hebrew writer says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Again, I think this makes this parallel, and I thought it was pretty neat to think of this parallel where Jesus' blood is like our vaccine and like our convalescent serum. It helps for our bodies, for our spiritual being, to be freed from the infection of sin. Now I want to just get on to the last spiritual application and point that I wanted to make, and it has to do with communion service, because if you remember, we talked about how Jews were strictly prohibited from ever eating blood in any way. And then Christ, when he was initiating the Lord's Supper, commands us to eat his body and drink his blood so that we may have life. Now we have done this, many of us, for many years, and so it becomes rather routine. But you know, the idea of it is, of drinking blood, is a little bit distasteful. But I think at the time that this was done, there was no known way to give a blood transfusion. That wasn't even heard of yet. But in a way, this is the way that we have Christ healing blood enter our bodies, is to take this. Not literally, I don't mean to imply this is literally, but it's a way to symbolize that. And it is a remembrance to us. So when we have communion service, we are commemorating Jesus' sacrifice. I think it's important also to remember that this is how we've received Christ, was through his sacrifice and through his blood. Remember that in the Old Covenant, worshipers would bring animals to shed their blood in order to obtain salvation from the sin and guilt. But in our New Covenant, it's entirely different. We don't bring anything but ourselves and our sin, and we are freely given this blood of Christ to free us from these infections of sin. So I hope that was helpful, and that concludes my lesson this morning. Thank you very much.